everyone, and welcome to our next webinar in the DASCIN webinar series. My name is Jan-Willem Middelburg, and I'm going to be your host today. And today we have a very interesting topic for you, which is everything about that you need to know about the GDPR Awareness and Certification Program. In the next 35 minutes, I'm going to take you on a brief journey to understand what GDPR is, why it's relevant, and what you should know about it as somebody working in an organization, but also in your private life. Before we get started with today's sessions, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please note that today's session is being fully recorded, so you can always watch back parts of the recording after the session. Once the session has ended, you will receive an automated email with a link towards the recording. So feel free to share this and rewatch some of the sections that you found interesting. The second part is that you have the ability to ask questions throughout the entire session. On the left-hand side of the screen, where you will see the panel with which you logged in, you will see that there is a Q&A box. Feel free to put in any kinds of questions over there, and I will moderate these towards the end of the session. And last but not least, note that all of the PowerPoint slides that you will be seeing today will be shared with everyone who is in attendance. So there's no need to take screenshots or take pictures with your phone. You will get an entire and complete copy of all the slides that are presented today. So now that we have that out of the way, let's get started. A very brief introduction for those of you who are joining our webinar series today for the first time. As I just mentioned, my name is Jan-Willem Middelburg, and I'm the director at Cybient and the president of the Data Science Institute. I do a lot of lectures at universities or in classrooms, and if I'm not doing that, I'm writing. On the screen, you see some of the publications that I've been working on in the last few years. And it's fair to say that besides teaching, this is one of my big passions. Today's session is being provided to you by the Data Science Institute, better known as DASCIN, which is an independent body of knowledge for the development and advancements of data best practices. DASCIN is known for its education, certification, and knowledge sharing programs, which enable governments, organizations, and individuals to use data in smarter and more sustainable ways, ultimately to increase decision-making. And today's topic is very much in line with that. We are going to look at how to safeguard data and what are the best practices when it comes towards the protection of data, but today is definitely going to be from a compliance standpoint. If you would like to learn more about the Data Science Institute, would like to join as a member, or even volunteer to become an ambassador, I strongly encourage you to visit the website at dascin.org. Today's session is going to be about GDPR, and some of the materials that you will see throughout the course today are based on the official GDPR handbook. This handbook, which you see on the screen, has the subtitle Awareness, Action, and Accountability. And I always think that this is quite a good number of keywords to summarize what GDPR is all about. In today's session, I'm primarily going to focus on the awareness segment of the GDPR. We're going to look at what it is, why it was developed, and what are some of the key provisions that everyone should know about the GDPR. The other elements of this handbook, action and accountability, will dive deeper in what are the things you can actually do to make sure that you comply to GDPR, as well as what are some of the measurable aspects from an accountability point of view. Note that the GDPR handbook is available again at the DASCIN website, and today's session is going to be largely based upon this. So after today's presentation, if you feel that this is useful, I strongly encourage you to go there and download the entire publication. Good. What are we going to talk about today? So in preparation for today's session, I thought it would be useful to cover a number of critical topics that we get a lot of questions about at DASCIN. I'm going to get started with giving you a bit of background around the GDPR, what it is, why it's important, and why it was developed in the first place. Then we dive a little bit more in detail, because one of the key purposes of these kinds of sessions is always to make sure that you learn something new. So I've compiled a number of key elements and need to know aspects about what everyone should know about GDPR. In the third aspect, we're going to look into GDPR awareness, what you or your organization can do to raise awareness and to make sure that you are a stepping stone closer towards awareness and compliance. And then last but not least, I will talk a little bit about the newly launched GDPR certification and how you can formalize an educational program to raise awareness about the GDPR. We have a lot to cover today, so I suggest that we're going to dive right into it. I'm going to get started with a brief explanation about what the GDPR actually is and why it's so incredibly important in today's day and age. The GDPR itself is nothing new. And when I say nothing new, it means that it was already adopted almost a decade ago. To be exact, on 14 April 2016, and it was enforced on the 25th of May 2018, so close to 7 years ago. The GDPR builds on specific regulations that were already in place throughout Europe, most notably the 1995 EU Data Protection Directive. The reason that the GDPR was developed was to harmonize different initiatives in EU member countries in order to ensure a consistent methodology across member countries. The whole reason for this was obviously because of the rapid digital transformation and the increased adoption and use of focus on data that we have seen in the last decade. And I think it's fair to say that that hasn't stopped at all. The driving point behind this regulation is the control of data, and specifically the rights that individuals have or should have with their own personal data. Throughout the years before the GDPR, various initiatives existed to protect individuals and the use of their data. But the GDPR really tried to harmonize that and make one uniform directive, or regulation, I should say, that is applicable for every citizen within the EU. So at this moment, you might wonder, especially if you're joining from non-EU countries, well, why is this relevant for me? And why should I care about this? I will explain that in the next few moments, but I can already let you know is that if you are dealing with any kind of citizen which is residing in the EU, you will need to follow the procedures within the GDPR, regardless on whether you or your organization is based in the EU or not. And that's a very important thing to notice, because throughout this session, I'm going to explain that GDPR awareness is not just relevant for the people who live in the EU, but for everyone that deals with customers or individuals potentially in the EU. And that very quickly becomes every single organization on the planet. So why is the GDPR more relevant today than ever before? And the short answer to that, as you probably expect, is artificial intelligence. The big AI boom that we have seen in the last 3 to 4 years is increasing the need and relevance of data protection and data regulation. With all the tools that are available today online, some of them free, you might have a lot of questions around what is actual data, what is fact, what is fiction. But more importantly, from a data privacy perspective, is what are the regulations around that? Key questions that we get asked a lot is, how do you classify if data is personal? And what data can organizations actually use in communicating with customers and use, for instance, for third-party purposes like marketing or branding? Are there any specific guidelines with the way this can be processed? And which data exactly is then suitable and eligible for processing? AI brings a range of new questions, especially if data, personal data, is transformed in the way that images are being created. And besides the fact on whether data is personal or not, a lot of questions remain with intellectual property. One thing is that all of these questions have in common is the aspect of control. And in the AI-driven world and AI-driven economy that we're moving into, one question is of paramount importance. How can individuals protect their personal information, and how can organizations put into place procedures to responsibly deal with personal information? And in the next part of this webinar, I'm going to give you some ideas, guidelines, and explain some of the key parts of the regulation to hopefully make you more familiar and more comfortable with the key provisions behind this. Good, let's take a step back and start with understanding what the General Data Protection Regulation actually is and how you should interpret it. Now, before we do that, I need to give you a little bit of a legal lesson. And the first thing to note is that GDPR is a regulation and not a directive. And let me explain why this is important. Under the EU regulations and parliaments, note that there are different ways in which laws are ultimately become valid for the member countries. If something is a directive, it is an instruction to each of all of the individual member countries to ensure that they create legislation that will implement that specific directive. But more strongly, and the GDPR is one of those areas, the GDPR is a regulation. And what that means is that it has gone into effect without ratification and adjustment of different member states. This means that the GDPR as is applicable in all of the member countries and is uniformly applicable in all of the individual countries itself. It's not going to be the case that a country like Italy will have a different interpretation of the GDPR than, for instance, Germany or Spain. The purpose of the GDPR is to protect all of the individuals that are residing in the EU and covers any personal data that can identify a person. It is a regulation that is highly focused around data protection. What do we mean with personal information? That is information with which we can identify a person. This includes contact details, identification numbers like social security, names, postcodes, and anything with which a person can reasonably identify it. A special class in the GDPR concerns sensitive data. And this is data that's not only personal identifiable, but is able to be used to create a unique profile of somebody. Here you can think about biometric data, health records, financial information, and every other data type that directly has something to do with the key characteristics of a person and can therefore be classified as sensitive. And then we have a category in between, which we call digital identifiers. A good example of that is, for instance, an IP address. An IP address does not directly indicate who a particular person is, but in combination with other records, an IP address can very easily be transformed in personal identifiable information. Same is true with specific codes, verification methods with which individuals can be identified, even if that information is being encrypted. So the core purpose of the GDPR is to protect this type of information, data that is able to identify persons. For instance, and this is important to note, this means that not all data falls under the GDPR. If you create a very simple Excel sheet today in which you just randomly put into a numbers, then that document itself is not, or the contents of it itself is not directly protected by GDPR. However, note that files like Excel sheets have typically metadata attached to it, which is personal identifiable. Think about the person that made it, your email address, maybe even your IP address, or the location data of where the Excel sheet was generated. And it's exactly these kinds of things that people tend to forget, and why the GDPR is so relevant today. Now, one of the most important provisions, and we generally start with regulations right at the top of the document and dive into more detail, is Article 1, which is about the subject matter and objectives of the GDPR. The full copy of the GDPR, by the way, is a free download, which is made available by the European Union. So if you just Google GDPR, you will be a very simple and quickly able to download a full copy. Article 1 of the GDPR goes into the subject matter and objectives. And there's one particular piece that I've highlighted, which basically gets towards the essence of what this regulation is trying to do. And that is the second clause of Article number 1. It states that the regulation protects fundamental rights and freedoms of natural persons, and in particular, their right to the protection of personal data. And I've highlighted this in yellow for a reason, because understanding the GDPR means that you need to understand that it's particularly about protecting rights and freedoms, and that it is specifically aimed at natural persons. Natural persons are individuals like you and me. The GDPR is therefore not set up to protect corporations or governments, although at corporations and governments, there will obviously be people and natural persons working that fall under this regulation. But in essence, it's all about protecting individual rights. And the reason that this is necessary is because data can be used for a lot of good, but it can also be used for activities which exploit that particular data and which drive people towards specific decisions. And in the EU, one of the fundamental beliefs is that as an individual, you have the right to data protection, and you have the right to control what organizations will do with your personal data. Note that this is a different belief to some other countries around the world. And I will not go into any specific examples, but this belief is not universally shared. However, if a company that or person deals with a person that is residing in the EU and therefore is protected by these freedoms, it means that they would need to set up similar procedures to the organizations that are in the EU. And that is a very important aspect to take into consideration, because even though you might not be living in an EU country, if you're doing business with EU citizens or natural persons like end users of software or applications that are in the EU, you automatically fall under this regulation and need to install the measures to protect those individuals and their freedoms. Now let's dive a little bit deeper and explain in slightly more detail why this GDPR was established and what it's aiming to do. As we have seen on the previous slide, the core purpose is to protect personal data. And as a result, the measures that are described and outlined in the GDPR provide measures to safeguard your personal data, as well as your individual privacy. And the whole purpose and reason for coming up with this regulation was to ensure that different initiatives across the EU were met or were combined in a uniform manner. The GDPR in itself also greatly extended the control and rights and freedoms that individuals have over their personal data. Now, today is way too short to go into all of the provisions and all of the clauses that the GDPR has, but I've highlighted a number of critical principles that I think everyone should know. And that has everything to do with the way that organizations have the ability to handle personal data. And you will see those three here listed on the slide. The first key principle is that organizations could and should only collect data for specific purposes. Later on, we will see that that will result into a principle of data minimization. Not collecting more data than you should, and only requesting information that is truly relevant for the purpose of the interaction and the engagement. The second aspect is that there is that an organization is the primarily responsible entity for making sure that your data remains accurate and that they put the necessary security measures in place to ensure that it's being safely stored and secured. In other words, as a citizen, you don't have the need or objective or requirement to protect your own data. That requirement is transferred towards organizations that are dealing with your data. That key provision immediately has a lot of implications because it means that organizations need to set up cybersecurity and information security processes, need to have reasonable measures in place to ensure that data doesn't get stolen, transformed, or misused in any way. So you can see that simple principles will have immediately large effects on organization. And last but not least, the third principle is that the organization should also be responsible for preventing unauthorized access to your personal data. This is not only true for unauthorized access externally, so that other people cannot access your data, but also internally, meaning that other departments or people who should not or do not have any interest in watching at your records should be prohibited from visiting or even watching those records in the first place. So key principles immediately have a lot of key influence in the way that organizations need to take measures in order to comply to these particular principles. And we'll dive into that a little bit more in detail. Now, as I have highlighted a few times before, and I would like to again stress the importance of this, the scope of the GDPR is much broader and larger than many people think. Obviously, any organization that resides or has an office or business within the EU is subject to the GDPR regulations. But even organizations that are outside the EU and that are offering goods or services to EU residents or citizens have the responsibility to comply to the key provisions and principles that we've just seen. And on the slide, I have listed some of the most important aspects that every organization that deals with protected citizens would need to take into consideration. First and foremost, we've seen the principle of data minimization. You should only collect the data that is necessary for a specific purpose and not more and not less. Long forms, which request you to fill in all kinds of information just for the sake of information, whilst that information is not being used, should be avoided. And if you don't do that, you will definitely get questions around why that data is being collected in the first place. The second aspect is the element of consent. Under the GDPR, individuals must give clear and informed consent for data collection. And this goes further than just clicking a tick box and saying that you're okay with it. You need to put measures in place to check whether people are understanding how their data is being used, and that there are clear records in place that individuals did give consent at a particular moment in time. Just as with digital signatures, this means organizations need to put measures in place that they can validate and verify that that consent has been properly given. Thirdly, organizations need to establish security and transparency, meaning that an organization needs to have security measures in place and needs to be able to explain how to the people that they've collected data from, how that information is actually being used. And last but not least, it needs to be able to give citizens access to their data. So an organization that is processing data from EU citizens needs to have procedures and processes in place to erase or change or completely delete records from their specific customers, a fact that very few people are familiar with. And many organizations are lacking the proper procedures to effectively arrange that. Good. So now that you know a little bit more about what the GDPR is and some of its key principles, note that there's a lot more, but for the sake of time, we only will give you some of the highlights today. The next question immediately becomes, well, why does this matter? Why should we take care of this? And first and foremost, on this slide, I've listed some of the key compelling reasons for businesses. The easiest way to explain why you should care is that it's the law and it's a legal obligation. Businesses must comply, and I always like to say, just like you will need to comply to paying your taxes, you will need to comply to the GDPR whether you like it or not. And if you decide not to, just as with your taxes, the penalties can be quite steep. Potential penalties in the GDPR are up to 20 million euros or 4% of your global annual turnover. And especially for organizations that are very large, billion-dollar companies, 4% of your turnover, and that means revenue, can very quickly run into the hundreds of millions of euros or dollars. Thirdly, not complying to the GDPR brings a reputational risk. More and more people are concerned with the way that data is being used and the way that data is being processed. And data breaches and data that's being stolen typically is coming into the news very negatively and can lead towards a lot of reputational damage for organizations. These are some of the deterrents and key reasons why people are typically forced into complying with the GDPR. But I always like to look at it from the positive side. Making sure that you comply to GDPR can bring a lot of serious business benefits. Organizations that take this seriously generally have stronger customer trust and loyalty, meaning that people are happy to do businesses with other organizations that care about this kind of stuff. That ultimately leads towards competitive advantage. And by showcasing that you're a responsible organization, you are set up for enhanced success compared to competitors who don't. And if you don't believe me, note that I've, in preparation for today's presentation, just looked up some recent articles around penalties and organizations that have come in the news. Over 2024, the total amount of fines in GDPR, and again, this article is from January 2025, amounted to 1.2 billion euros. And this is the composite number of fines that have been issued across Europe, which is a very, very significant amount. You also see that organizations are taking it more seriously, because compared to 2023, it's actually gone down, and more organizations realize the need to comply to this. On the right-hand side, you also see the business reason for being compliant. In comparison to just accepting the fines, non-compliance is around 2.71 times more expensive than making sure that you have your procedures and regulations in place. Yes, it will take some effort, and yes, there are costs involved, but by having a compliant organization, you will be able to reap more business benefits compared to any of your competitors. Now, besides the imperative for businesses to do this well, I also personally think that everyone living in Europe, as well as dealing with these kinds of things dealing with European customers, should know this on a personal level. Many people that I've spoken to over the years, if I start a conversation around GDPR, know that it exists, but absolutely have no idea what their personal rights are under this. And whereas a lot of people know their rights when it comes to dealing with law enforcement, police matters, speeding tickets, and things like that, they don't have any clue about what their rights are when it comes towards personal information. And having a better understanding of what your rights are as an individual and what you can subsequently do to enforce those rights, like, for instance, removing yourself from systems, removing yourselves from advertisements or mailing lists, is something that, in my opinion, everyone should know. Based on this knowledge, you can then start to make informed decisions, which companies you choose to interact with whom you're sharing your data, and to what extent you want to enable organizations to use that data for specific purposes. And again, in my personal view, if you don't care about this from an organization's perspective, it is definitely I would say, strong advice to care about this from an individual perspective, especially now when it comes towards artificial intelligence. You really need to start thinking about whether you are okay with the fact that people can use your photos, your information from certain information sources that you have provided your data to. And if you don't want that, what you should be able to do and to which provisions you need to reference in order to remove or diminish your exposure. So overall, and this is my key message on an individual level, being knowledgeable about GDPR gives you more control over your own data. And with that, it gives you more control about your own life. So what I hope that you take away from today's session is to start thinking about this. It's a topic that is not at the top of everyone's list, and it doesn't need to be. But being more aware of what this means enables you to start thinking about what your personal data is, and if you find that important, to what extent you are willing and able to share that with others. Know what you can do and can request from organizations, and have an ability to understand what other organizations can and cannot do with your data. By starting that awareness, I'm quite convinced that you're able to make more informed decisions and therefore have a greater sense of control about the things that you want or don't want to have done towards your data. So that's a little bit of background and information around the GDPR, and I'm strongly hoping that you picked up some new things from this. In the second part of today's presentation, I'm going to dive a little bit more into the certification part. And the reason that we created this certification with the Data Science Institute is because it's a relaunch of a previously created GDPR awareness program. As I've just mentioned, GDPR is a regulation. And as I stated before, it is mandatory to follow whether you like it or not. Yet many organizations don't have proper procedures for this in place and don't have the ability to do this. And for that reason, in once the GDPR was launched, our exam partner, APMG International, created a initial certification, which was called the GDPR Awareness Program. As we've just seen, that the launch was already in 2016, so it's been quite some time. And in the meantime, a lot of new elements have happened. Think about AI, the newly developed AI Act in Europe, and the way in which all of these large language models and other kinds of AI algorithms are using and processing data. So after some time, there was a high need for a refresh. And together with the Enterprise Big Data Framework and the Data Science Institute, we've decided to redevelop this certification together with APMG again. So in this next slide, you see some of the key rationale behind it. And we decided to start a fresh approach and create a new handbook, the GDPR handbook that I mentioned earlier, which forms the basis of this certification. This updated body of knowledge takes into account new developments like AI, the AI Act, and other trends within the data processing part, and has incorporated some of the latest amendments. The reason that we've chosen to do this under the Data Science Institute makes a lot of sense, because we have a strong community of data experts and have built a very strong thought leadership network over the years with ambassadors and people who are considered the thought leaders and specialists within their field. Note that the Data Science Institute is completely vendor independent, so we really wanted to relaunch and re-establish this certification from a neutral and vendor independent point of view. From that point of view, it also makes sense to really put this as one of our certificates under the Data Science Institute programs, because organizations that are already partners and that are already teaching one or more data topics can easily add this towards their portfolio. GDPR and the corresponding knowledge about that is something that every organization should have. And with this new credential, we have really tried to make the entry barrier to knowing about this slightly lower. And by doing this in the form of an exam, one of the other key benefits is that you have proof that people actually understand it. It is what we consider a awareness certification. So joining and being part of a training program should be sufficient for people to pass this examination. It's not meant as an in-depth study or an expert certification like some of our other data science programs, but something that enables organizations to quickly, rapidly, but also in a proven manner, showcase that they have put their employees on a higher level of awareness. And by looking at exam results, you also have verifiable proof that as an organization, you care about these aspects and have taken verifiable initiatives to upskill your people. And that really is the key reason why this certification is now relaunched. Compared to the previous certification, there's obviously some topics which are still the same, but in essence, it's a complete reboot. We started from scratch with a completely new syllabus, a new design, new course content, adjusted syllabus items. So you could say that it's basically a 2.0 or maybe even 3.0 version of this particular program. So I strongly encourage you after this webinar to get onto a course, learn more about the certification, either take the exam directly through the portal, or for those of you who are listening and that are part of our training ecosystem, to become a training partner. There's no significant requirements to become a teacher in this. If you're already part of our partner network, the only thing your trainer would need to do is pass the exam with the elevated score as per usual, and immediately you're set and ready to go teach this particular certification. So this message and this slide is a call out to everyone who's watching this or at a later stage to join us in our journey and get certified in this particular program. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time and your energy spending this afternoon with us to learn more about GDPR. I've seen some questions coming in while I was presenting, so we will now move towards the section where we will moderate some of the key questions. Good, let me go towards our Q&A part. First question is, who is the target audience of the certification and would it be more relevant to the corporate legal team? And I think that's a very good question. I would say that the corporate legal team is definitely a group that should be aware and they should know it from their job perspective. But I would say that this group is probably already familiar because it's their job to know. The core target audience of this certification program is more basically everyone in an organization that needs to know this or is dealing with data on a day-to-day basis. So what we've seen in the previous version of this program is that organizations just make this part of their onboarding program or run an annual certification cycle for all their new staff to make sure that this topic is periodically being addressed. And again, I'm not under the illusion that this is going to be the #1 top priority for every organization, unless you've had a data breach and you now feel the pain of the fines that have been awarded. But it is, I would say, a health check. And just as organizations periodically do things around raising awareness for things like sustainability, raising awareness around the way that data is being processed and used, I think that this initiative and GDPR is a periodical refresh to ensure that everyone in your organization is kept up to date to the things that are going on. And then the next question is, do I need to resit for this certification if there are changes to the GDPR? That's actually a very good question. In principle, the answer is no. So with our Data Science Institute certifications, we always ensure that all the certifications that you take have an unlimited lifetime span and they don't expire. So it might be the case that in the future, when there is a significant update for the GDPR, that there would be a version 2.0 or 3.0, but I don't foresee this at the moment. At this moment, as far as I know, the EU is not considering to do any major revisions. And even if they did, that would take at least, let's say, 5-6 years before that would happen. So it would take quite a significant and long time before that would even be the case. Very good questions. Good. I don't see any other questions coming in. So with that, I would once again like to thank you for being part of our Data Science Institute webinar series. I hope that you still find these very useful. So thanks so much for spending the time with us this afternoon. I hope you learned some new things and keep an eye on our calendar because we do these webinars very frequently and sign up for any of our upcoming series. Thank you so much for joining, and we will close the session for now.